Jacob Miller lay in the trench on his first night at the front. The sounds of war filled the air. Artillery shells, rifle fire, and the groans of the wounded turned the night into a nightmare. Jacob was a 30-year-old soldier, tall and broad-shouldered, with a softness on his face that war had not yet erased. He had left his family behind. His wife, Anna, and his 5-year-old daughter, Lily, were waiting for him at home. Wrapped in his blanket, Jacob closed his eyes. The cold air chilled him to the bone, yet sleep would not come. But that night he had a dream. In the dream, he was with his family, having a picnic in a sunlit field. Anna was smiling, and Lily ran into Jacob's arms. A river flowed nearby, its waters clear and calm. Jacob lifted Lily onto his shoulders and smiled at Anna. Everything felt peaceful and warm. When Jacob awoke, his eyes were filled with tears. The cold and darkness of the trench had returned, but the warmth of the dream still lingered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter he had written to Anna, reading it once more. "My dear, I miss you and Lily so much. Once this war is over, I'll come home," he had written. He had never finished the letter. After all, there was no telling when the war would end. Folding it carefully, he placed it back in his pocket and let his thoughts return to the dream. The river, Lily's laughter, and Anna's smile had given him hope. Jacob sat in the trench and looked up at the stars. In the midst of war, that dream had given him the strength to survive. At dawn, his unit stirred. Their commander ordered them to prepare for an assault. Jacob grabbed his rifle and joined his comrades. The soldiers were exhausted and silent, but a faint smile appeared on Jacob's face. His dream had reminded him of his family, a glimmer of light in the chaos of war. As they prepared, a fellow soldier turned to him. "Why are you smiling, Jacob?" Jacob answered, "Last night I had a dream. I was with my family. It gives me strength." The soldier nodded, admiring Jacob's resolve, but the shadow of the war loomed ever closer. The attack began. Jacob and his unit charged out of the trenches. Enemy fire rained down mercilessly. He fired his rifle, taking down an enemy soldier. But around him, his comrades were falling one by one. Taking cover behind a tree, he gasped for breath. The dream flashed in his mind, Lily's laughter, Anna calling his name. For a moment, he could hear them. When Jacob opened his eyes, he was back in the war, but the dream felt like a refuge. By the end of the day, his unit retreated, returning to the trenches. That night, he slept once more and had the same dream again. The shadow of war would test Jacob's hope yet again. Jacob Miller had returned to the trenches, having survived the first day of battle with his unit. That night, he sat wrapped in his blanket, the sounds of war still ringing in his ears. The thunder of artillery shells, the crack of rifles, and the groans of the wounded never ceased for even a moment. Jacob was a 30-year-old soldier who held deep love for his family. His wife, Anna, and his daughter, Lily, were waiting for him at home. The night before, he had dreamed of them, of a sunny field where they had a picnic together. That dream had given him hope. Throughout the day's battles, it had lingered in his mind, giving him the strength to survive. Sitting in the trench once more, he thought about the dream again, and a small smile appeared on his face. By morning, the unit gathered again. Their commander ordered them to prepare for another attack. The soldiers were exhausted, their faces marked by the toll of war. Jacob checked his rifle and joined his unit. Standing shoulder to shoulder in the trench, the men exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Breaking the silence, Jacob turned to them and said, "Last night I had a dream." The soldiers looked at him. One of them asked, "What kind of dream, Jacob?" Jacob began to speak. "I was with my family. We were having a picnic in a sunny field. My wife Anna was smiling. My daughter Lily ran into my arms. There was a river. Its waters were clear and calm." The soldiers remained quiet, listening to his words. One of them whispered, "That's a beautiful dream, Jacob. I wish I could have one like that." Jacob nodded. "This dream gives me strength. Think of your families, too." The attack began. Jacob and his unit surged out of the trenches. Enemy fire was relentless, and smoke filled the air. He fired his rifle, taking down an enemy soldier. But around him, his comrades were falling. Taking cover behind a boulder, he struggled to catch his breath. The dream resurfaced in his mind, and he closed his eyes. For a moment, he could hear Lily's laughter. It was as if Anna was calling his name. Then a soldier shouted, "Get up, Jacob. We have to move forward." Jacob emerged from behind the boulder and rejoined his unit. The battle raged for hours, and by the time his unit secured a hill, their losses were heavy. When he returned to the trenches, exhaustion overtook him. That night, as Jacob sat in the trench, a soldier approached and whispered, "Tell us that dream again, Jacob." Jacob nodded and recounted the dream once more. The golden sunlight in the field, Anna's warm smile, Lily's laughter, and the peaceful river. All of it brought faint smiles to the soldiers' weary faces. One of them reached into his pocket, pulling out a letter. "Your dream made me write this," he said, showing it to Jacob. Jacob looked at the letter and realized just how much his comrades needed hope. That night he slept again, and once more he had the same dream. This time Anna looked at him and Lily waved. When Jacob awoke, the bitter cold of the trench pressed against him, but the warmth of hope still burned inside. At dawn, the unit prepared to move again. Jacob grabbed his rifle and joined his comrades. His dream had given him strength, and he had shared that strength with his fellow soldiers. Yet he knew the shadow of war was always there. The second day would be even harder, and once again the war would test Jacob's hope. Jacob Miller greeted the morning from the trench, preparing with his unit for the second day of war. The sounds of battle hadn't stopped all night. Artillery shells exploded near the trenches, and the groans of wounded soldiers filled the darkness. Jacob was a 30-year-old soldier, and his dream was giving him strength. Every night he dreamed of having a picnic with his family in a sunlit field. His wife, Anna's smile, and his daughter Lily's laughter filled him with hope. He had shared his dream with his unit, and the soldiers had drawn inspiration from it. But the shadow of war loomed constantly overhead, and Jacob could feel it. As he checked his rifle in the trench, one of the soldiers beside him smiled and said, "Your dream gave us strength, Jacob." Jacob nodded, but the peace within him was being tested by the chaos of war. Their commander gave the order to defend a hill, and the unit moved out of the trenches. Jacob slung his rifle over his shoulder and advanced with the soldiers. Enemy fire was intense, and the air was thick with smoke. Jacob took cover behind a rock and shot down an enemy soldier. Beside him was his closest friend, Daniel. Daniel was a 25-year-old soldier, short but strong. Jacob and Daniel had met at the front and quickly built a deep trust. In the trench, Daniel always spoke of his family, his wife Emily, and the child they were expecting. When Jacob first told him about his dream, Daniel had laughed and said, "One day, we'll have a picnic with our families together." That day, Jacob and Daniel fought side by side. The fighting intensified, and the enemy launched a charge. Jacob and Daniel hid behind a tree, firing their rifles. Then a shell exploded near them. Jacob hit the ground, his ears ringing. Smoke engulfed the area as he searched for Daniel. He spotted him a few meters away. Daniel had been shot in the chest. Jacob crawled over and held his friend in his arms. Daniel's face was pale, and he was struggling to breathe. Jacob whispered, "Hang on, Daniel. I'll get you out of here." With a weak voice, Daniel said, "Don't forget your dream, Jacob. Tell Emily I said goodbye." Jacob couldn't hold back his tears. He gripped Daniel's hand tightly. Daniel took one last breath and closed his eyes. For a moment, the sounds of war faded. Jacob sat with Daniel's lifeless body in his arms, his heart shattered. When the order came to retreat, he had to leave his friend behind. Back in the trench, Jacob's hands trembled. Daniel's final words echoed in his mind. He sat in a corner and buried his head in his hands. His dream had given him hope, but Daniel's death had cast a shadow over that hope. That night, Jacob fell asleep, but the dream was blurred. The field was still there, but Anna's face was no longer clear, and Lily's laughter sounded distant. When Jacob awoke, he felt the cold of the trench and thought of Daniel. At dawn, the unit gathered again. Jacob picked up his rifle, but there was no smile on his face. The soldiers looked at him, and one of them whispered, "Tell us your dream, Jacob. Give us hope." Jacob shook his head and said, "Daniel is dead. My dream isn't the same anymore." The soldiers fell silent, feeling Jacob's grief. Once again, the shadow of war had tested Jacob's hope, and Daniel's death had darkened his dream. Jacob Miller sat in the trench, having made it through the third day of battle. The sounds of war never ceased. Artillery shells exploded near the trenches, and smoke covered everything. Jacob was a 30-year-old soldier, surviving through the ache of missing his family. Every night he had been clinging to a dream, a picnic in a sunny field with his family, Anna smiling, and Lily laughing with joy. That dream had given him hope, but the death of his closest friend, Daniel, had shaken him to the core. Daniel had been shot in the chest during a firefight and had taken his last breath in Jacob's arms. Since that night, the dream had begun to fade. The field was still there, but Anna's face was no longer clear, and Lily's laughter seemed far away. Jacob lay in the trench wrapped in his blanket, eyes closed, but sleep wouldn't come easily. At dawn, the unit moved out once again to defend a hill. Jacob grabbed his rifle and joined them. The soldiers were tired and silent, the weight of war written clearly on their faces. Jacob emerged from the trench and was met with enemy fire. The battle intensified and the ground was covered with the fallen. He took cover behind a rock and returned fire, but his mind was on Daniel. His friend's last words echoed in his ears. "Don't forget your dream. Tell Emily I said goodbye." Jacob closed his eyes and tried to recall the dream, but the field had turned gray and the river had grown murky. Anna's smile had vanished, and Lily's voice had faded to a whisper. When he opened his eyes, he was still in the middle of war, and his hope was slipping away. The fighting raged for hours, and eventually the unit lost the hill. Jacob retreated to the trenches and sat alone in a corner. Daniel's blood still stained his hands. He could still feel the weight of his fallen friend in his arms. A soldier approached and whispered, "How's the dream, Jacob? Tell us about it." Jacob shook his head. "It's fading. Daniel's gone. I can't see him anymore." The soldier said nothing, noticing the emptiness in Jacob's eyes. That night, Jacob slept, but the dream had completely changed. The field was gone. The river had disappeared. Anna and Lily were only shadows. In the dream, he called out to them, but there was no reply. When he woke, the cold and darkness of the trench surrounded him. Daniel's absence had cast a shadow over the dream, and Jacob was beginning to lose his hope. At sunrise, the unit gathered once again. Their commander gave the order for another assault, but Jacob's face was expressionless. He picked up his rifle and joined the others, but his steps were heavy. The soldiers looked at him, and one of them whispered, "Don't forget your dream, Jacob. It gave us hope." Jacob didn't respond. He lowered his eyes. The shadow of war had dimmed his dream and left him alone. As the battle began, Jacob emerged from the trench and faced enemy fire. He fired his rifle, but his mind was in the dream. Anna's blurred face, Lily's vanished laughter. They had hollowed something out inside him. Once again, the shadow of war was testing Jacob's hope. Jacob Miller greeted the morning in the trench, preparing with his unit for the fourth day of war. The sounds of battle filled the air. Artillery shells exploded near the trenches, and smoke choked the sky. Jacob was a 30-year-old soldier, and once his dream had given him hope. Every night he saw himself having a picnic with his family in a sunlit field. His wife Anna's smile and his daughter Lily's laughter had filled him with strength. But the death of his friend Daniel had clouded that dream, and the violence of war had dimmed his hope. As Jacob checked his rifle in the trench, his eyes stared blankly. The dream had become a shadow, and Jacob was filled with darkness. Their commander gave one final order, to retake the hill. Jacob took his rifle and joined his unit. The soldiers were exhausted and silent. The fatigue of war etched deep into their faces. Jacob emerged from the trench and was met with heavy enemy fire. The fighting intensified, and the ground was littered with bodies. He took cover behind a rock and fired his rifle. Then an artillery shell exploded nearby. Jacob collapsed, a sharp pain slicing through his leg. Smoke filled the air. He looked down. Shrapnel had pierced his leg, and blood was flowing. He crawled to the base of a tree, gasping for breath. His unit received the order to retreat, but Jacob couldn't move. As he lay beneath the tree, the dream came to mind. For a brief moment, he saw the field, but it was gray and faded. Anna's face remained blurred. Lily's voice was just a whisper. Jacob closed his eyes, trying to remember the dream. Just then, a soldier approached and grabbed his arm. The soldier was young, 18 maybe, and his face was filled with fear. He whispered, "Get up, Jacob. I won't leave you behind." Jacob shook his head. "My leg," he said. The young soldier wrapped Jacob's wound and lifted him onto his back. Enemy fire still raged, but the boy was determined to carry him back to safety. When they reached the trenches, Jacob was laid down in a corner. The young soldier sat beside him and whispered, "You told me about your dream, Jacob. That dream gave me hope too." Jacob opened his eyes and looked at the boy. His dream had spread through the unit and had touched even this young soldier. Jacob whispered, "The dream has faded, but I'll tell it again. For you." He tried to recall the field, Anna and Lily, but the words came with difficulty. The boy held Jacob's hand. "Hold on, Jacob," he said. But Jacob was weakening. His wound had worsened. That night, Jacob fell asleep, and the dream returned. This time, the field was clear. Anna was smiling. Lily was running. In the dream, Jacob walked toward them and felt peace. When he awoke, he was still in the trench. The young soldier was beside him, but Jacob's breathing had grown faint, and his eyes were beginning to close. The shadow of war had tested Jacob once again, but at the final moment the dream had returned. His hope, lost in the chaos of war, had come back to say goodbye. Jacob Miller lay in the trench, and the sounds of war were slowly fading. The fourth day of battle had ended, and Jacob had been severely wounded in combat. A piece of shrapnel had pierced his leg, causing heavy bleeding, and a young soldier had carried him back to the trenches. Jacob was a 30-year-old soldier, and once his dream had given him hope. Each night he dreamed of having a picnic with his family in a sunlit field. His wife Anna's smile and his daughter Lily's laughter had filled him with strength. But the death of his friend Daniel had blurred that dream, and the violence of war had dimmed his hope. In the last battle, however, the dream had returned. The field had become clear, and Anna and Lily had smiled at him once more. As Jacob lay in the trench, his breathing grew weaker, but the dream was still in his mind. The young soldier had never left his side. He was just 18 and had been deeply moved by Jacob's dream. Jacob's leg was in bad condition and the bleeding wouldn't stop. The boy pressed a cloth to the wound and whispered, "Hold on, Jacob. Don't forget your dream." Jacob opened his eyes and looked at the young soldier. The dream had come to say goodbye. He could feel it. He whispered, "The dream came back. The field was sunny. Anna and Lily were there." The boy nodded, his eyes filling with tears. Jacob's voice was faint, but there was peace in his tone. He closed his eyes and slipped into the dream again. This time it was different. The field was wider, the sun brighter, and Anna and Lily were walking toward him. Jacob stood in the middle of the field. Anna reached out her hand and smiled at him. Lily ran into his arms and said, "Welcome home, Daddy." Jacob lifted her up and embraced Anna. The river was still there, its waters clear and calm. Jacob sat in the field with his family and began to picnic. Anna took bread from a basket. Lily picked a flower and handed it to Jacob. He had found peace in the dream. The sounds of war were completely gone. But just then the young soldier gently shook him and whispered, "Jacob, wake up. The doctor's coming." Jacob opened his eyes and saw the smoke in the trench, but the dream still felt real. The doctor arrived and examined Jacob's leg. The wound was deep and infected, and Jacob had lost too much blood. The doctor shook his head at the young soldier and quietly said, "There's nothing we can do." Jacob didn't hear the words. He had returned to the dream. He was sitting in the field with Anna and Lily as the sun began to set. Looking at his family, he whispered, "I missed you so much." Anna placed her hand on his. Lily rested her head on his shoulder. Jacob had found peace in the dream, and his eyes slowly closed. The young soldier held his hand and began to cry. Jacob's breathing slowed, and he gave one last smile. The dream felt real. Jacob didn't want to leave the field. When Jacob's heart stopped, the trench fell silent. The young soldier didn't let go of his hand and whispered, "You found your dream, Jacob." The shadow of a war had taken him, but his dream had brought him one final peace. Jacob had said goodbye, somewhere between reality and a dream. Jacob Miller lay motionless in the trench, and the sounds of war had completely faded. The fourth day of battle had ended, and Jacob had been severely wounded in combat. A piece of shrapnel had pierced his leg, causing heavy bleeding, and a young soldier had carried him back to the trenches. Jacob was a 30-year-old soldier, and once his dream had given him hope. Every night he dreamed of having a picnic in a sunny field with his family. His wife Anna's smile and his daughter Lily's laughter gave him strength. But the death of his friend Daniel had blurred the dream, and the brutality of war had drained his hope. In his final battle, the dream had returned. The field was clear again, and Anna and Lily had smiled at him. But as Jacob lay in the trench, his breath had stopped. The young soldier held his hand and cried. The doctor arrived and confirmed that Jacob was gone. A heavy silence settled over the trench. The young soldier let go of Jacob's hand and lowered his head. He was just 18, and Jacob's dream had touched him deeply. Jacob's last words had been, "You found your dream, Jacob." And the young soldier couldn't forget them. The other soldiers stared at Jacob's body. No one spoke. For a moment, it was as if the war itself had paused, and the smoke slowly began to clear. The young soldier reached into Jacob's pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a half-finished letter addressed to Anna, written in Jacob's handwriting. It read, "My dear, I miss you and Lily so much. When this war ends, I'll come home." The young soldier folded the letter and placed it in his own pocket. He silently vowed to one day share Jacob's dream with Anna. The soldiers wrapped Jacob's body in a blanket and carried him from the trench. They dug a small grave beneath a nearby tree and laid Jacob to rest. The young soldier found a piece of wood and wrote Jacob Miller on it, placing it into the soil like a headstone. He stood over the grave and said his goodbye. The war raged on, but in that moment the trench felt calm. The young soldier returned to the trenches, thinking of Jacob's dream. The field, Anna's smile, and Lily's laughter stayed with him. Jacob's farewell had brought silence, though it would not last long. Days passed and the violence of the war began to subside. The young soldier, along with his unit, left the front and began a journey to deliver Jacob's letter to Anna. Finding Jacob's village took weeks, but one morning he arrived in a small town. The town bore the scars of war, homes destroyed, fields burned, but one house still stood. The young soldier knocked on the door and a woman answered. She appeared to be in her 30s, with long black hair and a pale face. He looked at her and asked, "Are you Anna?" She nodded and replied, "Yes, I'm Anna Miller." The young soldier took the letter from his pocket and said, "Jacob asked me to give this to you." Anna took the letter. As she read it, her eyes filled with tears. She invited the young soldier inside and they sat at a table. The soldier began to tell her about Jacob's dream. "Every night he saw you and Lily having a picnic in a sunny field," he said. Anna went silent and closed her eyes for a moment. Then she whispered, "Jacob's dream was real." The young soldier looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" he asked. Anna pulled an old letter from a drawer and handed it to him. It was written in Jacob's handwriting and had been sent at the beginning of the war. In it, Jacob had written about a dream. "Every night I see you and Lily in a field. That dream gives me hope." The young soldier read it and realized Jacob's dream had never changed. Anna looked at him and said, "Jacob never made it home, but Lily is still here." The young soldier asked to see her, and Anna led him to the back room. Inside, a 5-year-old girl lay in bed, pale and weak. Anna whispered, "Lily is sick. She's been like this since the war began." The young soldier looked at Lily and remembered the laughter from Jacob's dream. Just then, Lily opened her eyes and looked at the young soldier. In a soft, weak voice, she said, "Daddy?" The young soldier froze, and Anna began to cry. Lily had seen Jacob in a dream and mistook the young soldier for her father. At that moment, Lily took her final breath and her eyes closed. Anna collapsed beside her and realized her daughter was gone. The young soldier, shocked, stepped out of the room and left Anna alone with Lily. Jacob's dream had touched reality, but it ended in a way no one had expected. Lily, in the shadow of war, had seen her in a dream, and in her final breath she had been reunited with him. As the young soldier left the village, he thought about Jacob's letter and his dream. The silence of war had changed a family forever, and Jacob's hope had become entangled with a heartbreaking truth.